Listening to those kind words, it would seem almost like it's fairly heady stuff appearing on television. But anyone who's done it for any length of time comes to understand the real effect of the medium. Came home to me about a decade ago, and I received a letter, and it said from a viewer, "Dear Mr. Gregg, I'm writing you with regard to a recent conversation you had with evolutionary paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould concerning his theory of disequilibrium in the Jurassic period. My question for you is this: what's with your hair?" Anyway, we're not here to discuss the travails of being on TV. We're here to listen to one of the most successful and bold financiers in Canadian history, a member of the British House of Lords, a much acclaimed and best-selling author, and the country's most provocative public commentator and intellectual. The leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition, as referred to him as a little bit more plainly, as a convicted British felon. When all is said, however, he is someone for whom we seem endlessly fascinated, probably because, in no small measure, he is endlessly fascinating. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Conrad Black. Thank you for doing this.
I'm sure it'll be my pleasure, Alan. I thought you were, just hitting your stride in your introduction. I'm sorry you finished so quickly.
My first question is, why are you doing this?
Well, we've done it before, and I've always enjoyed my discussions with you. I mean, I can't say that every person in your walk of life who's questioned me has provoked that reaction, but I always find you fair and provocative in a good sense, and always enjoy myself. Besides that, as an author, that I have some duty to sell books.
I watched the recent interview you did with Peter Mansbridge, and you seemed fatigued with being in the spotlight all the time. In fact, you explicitly said that if you could avoid gratuitous controversy, you were going to try to do that. At the same time, anyone who knows you knows that you will defend your reputation and do everything to repair any damage that has been done to it with vigor. And
that isn't my definition of gratuitous controversy.
But you and I know what's going to happen. You are going to pillory one of your enemies tonight with some pithy quote. It will be in the newspaper tomorrow, and they'll be talking about Conrad Black again. How do you stay out of controversy given what you aim to do right now?
Alan, I'm a little disappointed that you've so misjudged me. I don't have any enemies. I've returned to this country as a virtual dove of peace with a sprig of mistletoe in my beak. I just don't believe in unilateral verbal disarmament, that's all.
Now, you wrote something that I found particularly revealing about your own assessment of your public profile in the most recent memoir, A Matter of Principle. And I want to read it, because you said, "I became a catchment for many traits and opinions I did not hold, dwarfed by a caricature public image that has lurched about like a clumsy monster for decades. Though wounded at times by this portrayal, I never grasped the real danger of it." Mm-hmm. Expand on that, and you've had time to reflect on this, that why you evoke the kind of response you do.
That part of it I'm not so sure, but on what I actually wrote, see, I've been, as you know, a relatively well-publicized person for 35 years, and at the outset of that, I thought, and I now think it was a mistaken view, both tactically and substantively, but I thought that since most people thought business was dull and businessmen were dullards, there was some useful purpose to be served in trying to liven things up a bit, which is essentially what I was trying to do. I wasn't trying to create a cult of personality or become synonymous with anything particular. I was just trying to say, commerce is important. You measure the wealth of a country by taking as long as it's not just velocity of money, the gross national product, and dividing it amongst the number of people in the country. And so it is a valuable activity. And it is actually quite interesting sometimes. And and I know this sounds absurd, but this was contrary to the conventional wisdom 35 years ago. And that was all I was really doing. And then parts of it I enjoyed and parts I didn't. And then the world being, as I now know better, the place that it is, the controversy rose, and some of it was quite antagonistic, and I got into the habit of replying to certain categories of antagonistic comment, and it just sort of escalated, you're saying, but I've had my innings in the center of the ring, so as I say, I'm happy to hand over to others now.
But, as you said, you have been no fan of verbal disarmament. And you also wrote while you were in prison, you confess, you say, you could have played your cards more diplomatically, and when I return, I will. Mm-hmm. Do you still feel that way, or was that just the remorse of the time?
That was a classic whim when I was a guest of the U.S. government? No, I know that is in fact what I've been back almost 2 months, and that's in fact what I've done. I haven't. There hasn't been anything controversial in the time I've been back that caused by me. I did reply to the leader of the opposition, but when the CBC exposed the fact that my account of things was correct, and there was absolutely no suggestion of improper political interventions or activity, I was asked by a journalist from an out-of-town newspaper by email if I wanted to comment, and basically inviting me to rub Mulcair's nose in it a bit. And I said, no, let's let bygones be bygones. I mean, 35 years ago, I might have thought it was a free goal on the NDP, but I didn't think of that.
Well, in fact, you do claim that, notwithstanding you would have rather chosen another way to spend the last 10 years, that you weren't completely miserable while in prison, and that in fact incarceration actually changed you.
I didn't emphasize how much it changed me. That has been a matter of some comment, but I don't feel that I'm the best person to comment on that part of it. Again, I'll answer the first part of your comment in a second. I feel that's a little like a person signing his own expense account. It's not for me to get into really how I've changed. I don't feel I have changed that much, but certainly I saw some things that while I had no particular ambition to see them, and especially not under those circumstances, were quite interesting. And I do have the view, as I'm sure most of us have, at least to some degree, that I don't want to get into matters that are too philosophical or theological here, but life is a privilege, and we have to try and make the most of whatever portion of it we have at any time. And while it was outrageous in terms of my being convicted of things I didn't do and exposed to the vagaries of the U.S. justice system, which is a pretty wild and woolly business, as anyone reading much of my book would know if they didn't know it before, it was actually quite interesting. As I used to say to some of my fellow residents, this is awful, of course, but we actually live better than probably 80% of the people in the world. I mean, it isn't that bad, And in fact, for some of them, I would reckon that 20% of the people in the low security facilities of the U.S. federal prison system, if you opened the gates and took down the fences, they would cling to the furniture. You couldn't chase them out, because many of them would really be derelicts if they were on the outside. And as it is, I actually did something while I was there. I was trying to teach people and read a lot and write, and I built, if I may say it, a very large readership for the stuff I wrote. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to filibuster you, but some of these guys, they did nothing but watch television all day and play cards, and that was it, and they loved it.
I want to talk a little bit more about that experience, but first, let's go back, because what you've gone through is complicated, and I don't think all that well understood. I'd like to parse some of it down. Back to the period first, 2003 to 5. The case against you started with allegations of corporate kleptocracy and fraud in the order of $500 million, most of which you've been acquitted of. But
most of which, 499 million. 715,000, and the rest was approved by the directors. And it was vacated by the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously. Most of which is a slight understatement, but please go on.
Given what you just said, we shouldn't be surprised that you've called this a smear campaign, but also a personal vendetta. Why you? Why were you being targeted?
Now that requires me to speculate on the motives of other people, which it's not really for me to impute motives to people, but there would be a range of different motives. And some of the people felt that their careers could be enhanced by what they did if they were playing a direct role.
These are U.S. prosecutors.
Yes, and some would be antagonistic for ideological reasons, or some would just be a personality aversion, or some would be some degree of envy, and there would be lots of other reasons. But I mean, if you try and categorize the motivations for people doing uncharitable and nasty things, you get into a very long and, after a while, a rather neurotic, not to say psychotic, summary of events. And we had, believe me, over 9 years I heard a lot from these people, and we had the whole range of psychiatric variety.
You sued Richard Breeden, former head of the SEC, and a number of Hollinger directors who were responsible for these original allegations, and then you settled out of court. I mean, can you comment on that at all?
Yeah, well, they treated it being all of the respondents except one were Americans. One was a Canadian, but the others were all Americans. And they treated it as a joke, as Americans do treat libel matters, because, as you know, probably most of the people here would know, in the United States, there is really no civil tort of defamation. You have to prove intent to defame, and as a practical matter, that's very, very difficult. I think Carol Burnett did it against the National Encounter for the most unimaginable libel, and she did get a big award, but it's extremely rare. And so they thought this was a ho-hum, but they didn't realize that I'd sued them in Canada, which I had a right to do because obviously their allegations against me circulated in this country. And so they eventually took counsel and assumed that since I'd been convicted of something, I had no traction at all. And then their counsel said, that's not quite how it works in Canada. And the judge at the Superior Court of Justice in this city determined that not only did I have a right to sue in Canada, even though I was not a resident or citizen of the country at the time, but I had adequate connections to it and so forth, but that the rule would be applied of one, since the remarks objected to vastly exceeded what I was convicted of, there was a prima facie case, and two, they would apply the rule of would a Canadian court seized of the same evidence return any guilty verdicts, which of course they wouldn't. No civilized country in the world except the US would have convicted anybody of anything on the basis of the piffle that was administered in that court in Chicago as evidence. And so then they started to take fright, and we settled a whole bunch of lawsuits because I held their feet to the fire and said, we're not settling this libel case until we settle all of this. And so we made a settlement. Now it's been held up now because there's a group of pensioners claiming that some of the money shouldn't be distributed because they have a claim, even though it is legally unrelated. But they are aggrieved pensioners, and I sympathize with them. But we're not a party to that. They're fighting it out with the American lawyers who stand to gain their part of the settlement. But yes, they did in fact settle on the basis of by far the largest libel settlement in the history of this country, $6 million.
2007, you were acquitted of most of these original charges,
yes,
but that in fact convicted on 3 counts of fraud, now not 500 million, but 6 million, and 1 count of obstruction of justice, sentenced to 42 months in jail.
78 months initially.
Were you surprised? Were you prepared? Did you ever think when you went to trial, we talked right before we were doing the Nixon book, that you were going to go to jail?
Oh, well, yeah, it's a distinct possibility. They win 90% of their cases, and there are a lot of innocent people in American prison. So, yeah, it was something I knew could happen. It's not all that rare, Alan. If 20% of the people would cling to the furniture, at least 10% of the people didn't do anything. They didn't do anything. They no more committed crimes than you did.
But you were Conrad Black.
Yeah, well, that and the correct fare will get me on the public transit system. It doesn't help you in the U.S. legal system.
So you were prepared.
You'll be aware that we're going now to try and expunge the surviving guilty verdicts.
Yes, no, I'm not surprised.
Because they denied me my Sixth Amendment right of counsel of choice. And the counsel I had did their best and had their moments. But if we'd had the counsel that I would have had, if they hadn't, on the basis of what the jurors found to be a false affidavit by the FBI, seized the proceeds of a cooperative apartment that I sold in New York, and which they knew by illegal telephone intercepts, by the way, to be what I designated as the $10 million retainer for my rapacious American lawyer, we would have won everything. At first instance, we'd have cleaned them out. Now, I'm not criticizing the lawyers I had. They did their best, and we, as you said, they got rid of 85% of the case. But that's actually what happened.
The obstruction of justice charge related to that, now infamous grainy video of you and an aide taking boxes out of 10 Toronto Street. What were you doing there? What was your intent?
One of the local courts evicted me from a building which I in fact owned and where I had had my office for 27 years. I was supposed to leave in 6 days, 6 business days. Naturally, I had to take some records out. Now, there was a court order, and I inquired of my assistant if the material that she'd assembled, I had nothing to do with assembling it, and she'd put in these boxes, if it met the criteria which I described to her, so there'd be no doubt about it.
This is the document retention order that said that certain materials could not be taken out.
That's right, and I wanted to make sure we weren't violating it. And I've never been accused of violating it, by the way. This is the home jurisdiction. I've never been accused of violating that retention order, and I did not violate it. And she assured me that after I told her the criteria that no, that doesn't fall under any of that. And then I spoke to the acting president of the company. Fine, he said, you take it. I spoke to the senior representative of the court-appointed inspector. He said, well, that's no problem. And I said, all right, well, let's take it out then. And as we were taking it down the stairs to where my car was, we walked down the stairs, but the boxes were already assembled at the back door. As we were going down the stairs, I pointed to the camera, which I had installed, by the way.
As CEO of the company.
If I didn't know that I was saying, I want to make sure there is no doubt about us doing anything furtive here. We'd had 5 subpoenas from the SEC. Every document in that office, everything. Letters of condolence on the death of my brother years before. Completely obscure, everything. They'd been through everything, they had copied everything. They had absolutely everything. And if I had wanted to take anything out of there, I could have taken it any time in briefcases, in my pockets, having visitors in and have them put it in their pockets for months and for some days after. I would have to be stark, raving, foaming at the mouth, mad to take out documents obstructing an investigation that way. I mean, it's just insane. As my counsel at the first appearance at the Court of Appeal in Chicago, the former Deputy Solicitor General of the United States for 16 years under administrations of both parties, said, in 45 years of practice, this is the feeblest excuse for an obstruction charge I have ever seen.
You also write in your memoir that what sustained you while in prison was your faith and your marriage. Most people don't really associate with you with faith.
Did you say faith and or faith in?
Faith and your marriage. Talk to me about your faith.
Well, Alan, I'm of that school that doesn't get too public about these matters, but let me see, what can I say? If you believe in any plausible definition of God, I don't mean, a British humorous description of heaven as a huge plate of custard or something. Any sort of definition of God that's halfway serious. It isn't difficult to convince yourself that, in general, there is some sort of, how should I put it, some sort of thought given to how things unfold, and that things unfold according to something that in the first place makes sense to a celestial authority, and in the second place it's difficult for us to judge because we can't really see all the elements of it. And so it is possible in that scenario to develop a partial comfort level that in the first place it's not as dark as it appears, and in the second place, as I said earlier, life goes on. My health was good. The people around didn't bother me. Obviously I didn't want to be there, but I had no problems at all with either the regime, despite their limitations, which were pretty serious at times, or any of the fellow residents. I never had a problem with anybody, and it was for finite time. And I have never wavered in the view that it is a completely respectable and even a rather creditable cause for a person unjustly charged to defend himself, and that's what I was doing. I had appeals going on all this time. I never gave up, and I still haven't given up. And indeed, we have won virtually all the case. And so I had, a purpose to soldier on, and while it was certainly uncomfortable and irritating and a kind of artificial state of subordinacy to these regiments of unskilled labor dressed up in federal officers' uniforms could be tiresome. I convinced myself, and not in a sort of self-brainwashing, I mean in a thoughtful way, that in some ways it might actually be a positive experience in that I could test my own capacities for certain types of annoyance and learn something about an unfortunately large part of society that I wouldn't otherwise have any exposure to.